and we'll be able to get started with our Coach Caregiver webinar for tonight. So this is all about you, this webinar. It's our Coach Caregiver Check Up. And we're really hoping that you will take this opportunity, and really appreciate those of you who did already take the opportunity to put questions on our website. We have received those questions, and we will be answering those questions, and any not have already been asked. So for Family Caregivers of BC, first of all, my name is Janet McLean, and I am the Education and Engagement Lead for Family Caregivers. And Family Caregivers is a nonprofit charity dedicated to supporting and the well-being of family caregivers. We've been around for 27 years, and we are the first provincial organization in Canada. Since 2010, we have been provincial with funding from the Ministry of Health, and in the last 3 years, funding from the Patients as Partners initiative. And 100% of our staff and 60% of our board members have caregiving experience. So we think it's really important that we understand what you are going through as a caregiver. We offer all kinds of support and education services, as you can see from this slide. We have information and referral and navigation through our support line that you can call this toll-free number. And we do have one-on-one coaching sessions for very complex situations. We support groups, so we do have some of our own, but we also facilitate that capacity throughout the province. We have webinars and materials on our site about how to start support groups. And we have an extensive online resource center. If you visit our web page, you will see that. In terms of our education, we have webinars such as this one tonight. We do events and presentations, and again, we have our resource center with recordings of past webinars. So really encourage you to visit our website and have a look around. We have a newsletter that comes out quarterly. We will have a new issue out in January. And on top of all of that, we collaborate and engage with the health system and participate in research. So there are opportunities for you as caregivers to become involved in that aspect of our work if you're interested, and we would love to hear from you if you are. And if you go on our website, you'll see that there are places where you can indicate that interest. So just in terms of webinar norms, for anyone that's new, confidentiality is essential. We welcome everyone to participate, and we'll try to make sure that everyone gets equal time, but we also respect people's decision just to listen. And the only advice we have is be aware that the experiences that might be expressed tonight or shared may not be yours, but what you're listening for are any of the takeaways that might apply to you. So it is very much a coaching format. Our learning objectives for tonight is just to hear what's on your mind. We're really hoping that these Coach Caregiver sessions will become more of a conversation with you, so we invite you to ask us questions so that we can respond to what's on your mind. And as I said, Jodie in particular, and I will jump in when needed, will try to help you with your questions. So again, please participate. And sadly, Wendy's not with us, and so we send her our best wishes for speedy recovery. But we do have, and are so fortunate to have Jodie with us tonight. And Jodie is a consultant with Family Caregivers, and in addition to being the executive director of the Cowichan Family Caregiver Support Society, she does about a million other things. She's an instructor at Vancouver Island University, an integrative body psychotherapist, and has worked in crisis intervention, family support, mental health, and community development. So she's just an invaluable member of our team. So what we're going to do now is just turn it over to the questions that we received. We did receive some after this presentation was prepared, so we'll just speak to those ones. And what I've also done is I've just filled the presentation with some materials that we can quickly refer to if we need to. So with that, I'm just going to go to the first question. And Jodie, I'll let you read this question, and we'll just start from there.
Okay. So the first question, what is a good balance between self-care and caring for other people. And I think this is one of those questions that, I suppose it is different for everyone. We have different capacities. We have different emotional relationships with the people that we're caring for, and sometimes that can make it more complicated for us. But I think, what we're maybe more familiar with is what happens when it's not a good balance. When we don't have a good balance between caring for ourselves and caring for other people, what happens? We feel stressed. We feel very burdened by the caregiving tasks. We can get very short-tempered. We might have a lot of resentment. We start to do what I call keeping accounts, where we start to count or make an account of all of the tasks and things that we're doing versus all of the tasks and things other people are not doing. And so we start to get a little challenged around what our role is. And essentially I think we stop enjoying life. We stop really having as many lighthearted moments. We don't see the humor in things. I hope some of this is sounding familiar. So I think that for most of us, it's what happens when we're not balanced between self-care and caring for other people is we start to show some cracks. So we talk a lot about self-care, and we also know that many people find self-care a little frustrating, that the idea of self-care can be a bit annoying when we're overwhelmed, or, just the reality of our lives as caregivers sometimes, makes the concept of self-care a bit laughable, or perhaps even yet another thing that we have to do, like one more task for the list, And the whole thing about self-care is it's not supposed to be a burden. And what I like to say is that self-care can be as small as just seeing and hearing yourself with some honesty in your own experience. So very often when we're in a caregiving relationship, the other person is not really able to see and hear us in the experience that we're having. And sometimes we very particularly don't want them to see that it's frustrating for us or it's difficult for us. We very deliberately sort of keep that to ourselves. And that's fine and perhaps part of the caregiving relationship. But we have to remember to be able to see and hear ourselves in that moment as well. So being able to just, often what I'll say to clients is just put a hand on your chest. Just on your sternum or a little above your sternum, and just, acknowledge yourself and say, oh, this is hard. This is frustrating. I'm frustrated right now. I don't have a lot of energy, feeling really low energy. Just acknowledging the truth of a moment makes it much more likely that you are going to take some action, whether it's probably not in that moment, but maybe even later that day or the next day. It makes it much more likely that we're going to take some action to care for ourselves. So that seeing and hearing ourselves is a huge part of what self-care is. Okay, let's see. Maybe we'll go to the next.
So yeah, one of the things that I did, I went into some of our resource materials, and on our website, actually, on the resource page, you'll find almost all of the materials that we're referring to tonight. This is the Caregiver's Bill of Rights. And so as Jodie said, what it's doing here is just kind of stating what are the rights of everybody, really, but in particular, someone who's caring for someone else. It's the self-care piece, taking care of yourself, seeking help from others, maintaining areas of your own life, allowing yourself to feel, as Jodie said, like cueing in to what you're feeling and how that's going for you, and understanding what might be some of your reaction, rejecting manipulation attempts, being able to receive consideration and help from others, taking pride in what you're accomplishing, and protecting your own individuality and right to your own life. So Yeah, and if anybody would like to chime in, either by, I see Maria is typing, so that's fantastic, or raise your hand, and we've got a small enough group that we can open it up for people to talk as well. So, yeah, and I think what Jodie was just talking about with self-care is hard but so important. So it starts with identifying yourself as a caregiver and then informing yourself about what you need and then going from there. So this was from one of our earlier webinars on navigating healthcare.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to pop back to the previous slide for a second, Janet.
Yeah.
And so when talking about this idea of seeing and hearing ourselves, so this idea of I see you and I hear you. So, being able to give that message to ourselves. And so some of this on the Caregiver's Bill of Rights fits right into that idea that we might be the only person who's able to recognize that we are angry or getting depressed. We might be the only person in any given moment who's able to take pride in what we were able to do, and so a lot of the time the resentment that grows when we're in a caregiving role is because other people can sometimes be a little tone deaf to what we're experiencing. If people say, oh, gee, you look tired, or hey, I don't see you out at exercise class anymore, or, something that's like, yeah, do you have any idea what my life is like? Do you have any idea what I'm going through? And so a lot of the time we are looking outside of ourselves to have other people see us. And yet so much of the hardest work of caregiving isn't really seen. There's this lovely quote that I've been using in some of my presentations that says, invaluable and invisible. Those two words, more than any others, describes the 8.1 million caregivers in Canada. So invaluable and invisible. There's something about caregiving in itself that makes us somewhat invisible. So it's so important that we're able to just develop this sort of dialogue with ourselves. And of course, I'm not advocating talking to yourself necessarily, but just that inner voice and the idea that, it's our job to take good care of our spirit while we're doing this work. That's the only way that caregiving can be sustainable.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And sorry, we're going to be whipping around this slide presentation, but we do have here, and in every newsletter, we've made it a point now, based on some really good feedback, that we should have the caregiver stress test in all of our newsletters. And so here it is. These are some really good ways to do that. Check on yourself, as Jodie said. Take care of your own spirit. So if you're just not sure how you're even feeling, this is one way to do a check-in.
And I love, this is my own little thing, so you can tell me if you think this is a little crazy, but I like to ask these questions, and I think I'm going to do this. I'm going to type it up in the reverse. So wouldn't this be a lovely checklist to have on your fridge, in the reverse? So you could say, I get enough rest. I have enough time for myself. I have enough time to be with other family members besides the person I care for. I feel good about my situation. I get out as much as I can. I manage the conflict I have with the person that I care for. I am doing as well as I can with the conflicts I have with other family members. I sometimes cry, and that's okay. I don't worry about having enough money to make ends meet. I feel as though every day I'm gaining the knowledge and experience that I need to give care as well as I would like, and I'm taking care of my own health. Right? So it's just sort of the idea that even if you had that as a visual on your fridge or something, because, to be honest, this is a great caregiver stress test. I think it absolutely works perfectly in that if you're going to go down this with a pencil and check the boxes, it will be completely accurate as to whether or not you are under stress. Absolutely.
That's a great idea.
It does exactly what it's meant to do. But if you were to just read this list every day, the list itself is quite depressing. Imagine this list as a journal entry. I can't get enough rest. I don't have enough time. And, it's like, whoa. It's very, dire, which, for some of us is our situation. But I love the idea of doing it more as a preventative, right? And just sort of reminding ourselves. The same stress test can also function as a self-care list. Oh, right, I have to get enough rest. Oh, right, I've got to make sure that I've got time for myself. And there's no perfection in caregiving. There's no perfection in any of life. But particularly in caregiving, we're not going to say, I don't have conflicts with the person I care for. We're going to say, I manage the conflicts. I do as well as I can with the conflicts. I'm learning to resolve the conflicts with the person I care for and with other family members. And it's a great way to see and hear ourselves in our journey, because this caregiving is a process and a journey. And, many, many days it's quite confusing. So I think this list can also function as a little bit of a touchstone, to remind us of the things that will help us continue caregiving and to feel good about caregiving.
Right. Well, I think that one is, I think we've kind of answered that question, unless anybody has anything else to add to that. So maybe we can move to the next question. So this one came from Brenda, and Brenda has asked a number of questions about case managers in the community and how one accesses a case manager. So this can be a bit tricky, as we have 5 different health authorities across the province, and each one of them has slightly different procedures. But in general, what I've done here is I've just copied some slides, and I will make this whole presentation available to you. I'll send it to you with the evaluation for the webinar. But typically what happens is access to community services are received through a central intake line. And so what it means is that anybody can call. You don't have to be a professional. Professionals can also refer in through the intake line, but basically there's one funnel for all of the requests for community services, and then that information is sent to geographic teams who will then address it. And from there, there might be a number of ways that the health authority responds, but typically, they might send out a quick response team if they feel it's an emergency, or if you've just been discharged from acute care. Most often you're going to get a visit from a case manager, but there might also be involvement from these other professionals that I've listed here: physiotherapist, occupational therapist, dietitian, or social worker. Case managers are the gateway to further services. So what happens when a case manager comes to your home to do an assessment? So if you have a care recipient that needs an assessment done because you're feeling that you can't keep up with the needs of the person that you're caring for, that case manager will come to your home and they do a formal assessment. So they discuss the needs with you and the care recipient. Then they develop a health plan. They'll do some eligibility assessment for all kinds of different services, and they'll provide you with information on the services, and then they will authorize those services so that they can refer to the services in the community that need to respond to your needs. So it could be home support hours or respite, either in the home or through adult day programs, a short-term facility stay, and as well, they look after referrals into facility-based care, so whether that's assisted living or residential care. And they refer to all these other programs as well. So they'll give you information about meal programs, transportation options, support groups, medical alarm systems, and different private services. So then the question is, well, as a caregiver, how do I interact with a case manager around the care planning and delivery? And, that comes down to really becoming a good advocate for your care recipient. So it's really about being prepared. So this slide talks about, approach it as a collaboration. The case manager is there to work with you to meet the needs of your care recipient. And so it really helps if you're prepared in advance, if you have a really good idea about what the needs of your care recipient are, and that person can also speak for themselves if they can. And what are the areas where you're feeling overwhelmed as a caregiver that you can no longer meet those needs yourself and you need some help? So when you're clear with the case manager, that really helps the case manager understand your needs and provide you with information about what's available, what can be provided through the healthcare system, and what you might have to seek out on your own. The bottom point here is, it's sometimes, we hear a lot when we get calls, people frustrated with the case managers, and, oftentimes there's a good reason for that, but in general, they're trying to do their job, and, they're following policy directives, and so if that's not meeting your needs, your issue may need to be dealt with on a different level. This is someone you really want to develop a relationship with, and sometimes it's an ongoing relationship, so it's really important to be aware of that at the front end. Again, some just tips about how to be the best advocate possible. Ask open-ended questions, so you're really, you're not making any assumptions. Be curious. And really make sure that you're talking from the needs that you have and the needs of your care recipient. Listen to the other person and their comments. So you got to listen to what the case manager has to say and try to stay in the conversation. Reflect back and repeat what you think you've heard, just to make sure that in fact you are hearing clearly and you're understanding. And try and be positive and goal-oriented. So here's the 5 Ps. Be positive, patient, proactive, productive, and polite. So it's not an easy role, but trying to anticipate what might be the future needs. And, there's all the tips about navigating. But, Jodie, I don't know if you have anything to add to that to answer this question.
I think, it speaks to... and I know some of these slides come from the webinars that you've done on navigating the healthcare system. So, it's part of the huge learning curve. Some of us in our lives prior to caregiving, never had ever heard the word case manager or had no idea what that was. We've never had to think very much about what a social worker does or beyond having a vague notion. So part of the challenge, I think, is just all the information that's coming at us and the fact that, some of these terms are not particularly warm and fuzzy, case manager. So does that mean we're the case and we're going to get managed by this person? We don't always think of ourselves or our care recipient as a case. So sometimes I think there's a powerlessness or a perception of powerlessness that comes with, sort of surrendering to the system. Case managers can be wonderful. They can be very efficient. They know all about the resources that are available in the ideal. I think the challenge that happens with case managers and why maybe some of us have ambivalent feelings about them are because in the system they function as a bit of a gatekeeper. So say that we really would like to have, let's say, 10 hours of home support, and the case manager is the person who will make the decision, based on their own criteria about whether or not that's what we get. And we might not get that. We might get half as much. Or we might think that our care recipient, qualifies or should go to a certain program or other. And perhaps the case manager doesn't agree or, doesn't have that resource available, or there's a wait list. So sometimes the case manager is in a position of having to give us bad news, things that we don't want to hear. Another piece is that often people have expectations for what the healthcare system is going to be able to do for them that don't really meet the reality. And so sometimes the case manager is there to sort of give us a bit of a reality check of what's going to be possible, and that doesn't always feel very good, So I think sometimes we don't like that relationship of having somebody who's going to basically green light or red light some of what our our ideas are, or we might not have any ideas, but this person is just recommending something that doesn't feel right to us, or we don't feel comfortable with it. So there is, like with all healthcare services, we don't always think about it this way, but there's a power dynamic, right? The physicians, nurses, social workers, case managers, they have a level of expertise that, us, and we are on the receiving end of that expertise. And of course, we can always choose, to do what we like and not to follow professional advice. But I think that often in that dynamic, there can be some vulnerability for caregivers and care receivers because, essentially someone is telling us what we ought to do or suggesting a certain pathway, and we may not agree, and that's where I think the relationship with case managers can sometimes be more difficult. The last thing I'll say about that is that sometimes I think we also have perhaps a totally different expectation of the case manager, as in we feel excited about that. We go, yes, oh, thank goodness, someone is going to come in and manage my case. I was just completely overwhelmed. I'm just going to turn it over to this person. They're going to really help me out. And, if we have a minimal home support, for example, and not very many other referrals, we might not get very much case management. We might not have a lot of involvement with a case manager. Case managers generally do most of their work with more complex cases. So sometimes we might have an expectation of what a case manager can do for us, and we might just have very brief contact with that person as they sort of pass us off to other referrals.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Jodie. And certainly we get calls to our support line on that very thing, where people are disappointed in the level of services that they actually receive from the healthcare system. And what I usually find is when I talk to those people a bit more about what are the gaps that they're finding and what they might do about those gaps, I often end up referring them to other resources in the community that they didn't know about, that aren't formally part of the healthcare system. And also, I have to say, referring them to support groups, because what I've found is that people learn so much from each other when they're navigating caregiving, just in general, about resources. Oh, did you know about, the group that does the driving for, they'll take you to appointments, they've got volunteer drivers, or did you know about this? So it to the point of the next slide, it's about developing a team. And it doesn't have to be just within the healthcare system. It really is about broadening your team and sharing the care with whoever you can. So that can be your case manager and the people that are formally referred, but it can also be other community services or other caregivers who simply just give you some really good advice about things you can do. So I think it's just trying to be respectful and resourceful is really a key part of managing the relationship with the case manager and any of the other healthcare professionals that you encounter.
Mm-hmm. And another piece I think that's really worth talking about, this came up for me, is that this week, because I was teaching a class about how to create circles of support. And circles of support are sort of a way that we can create a more strategic plan for family, friends, neighbors, community members around a caregiving family to get those people sort of more organized to offer care and support. And one of the things that happens, I think, for caregiving families is that often we really don't want to ask the people in our lives. It's really, it's uncomfortable for us to ask someone to come perhaps and do some respite for us, or to sit with our care receiver so we can go grocery shopping, or, it's tough for us to ask for what we need, but it's less difficult in a way to ask for professional services. like in a way that makes us more comfortable, the idea that some paid person is going to come and do that for us, and then we won't have to ask our neighbor down the street or, that woman from our church or whatever. And so I think the reality of caregiving and the kind of caregiving that I see in sort of a big picture is that caregivers would be held by community. They would be fully supported by both formal services and informal services. And the reality of that is that we actually need our neighbors and friends and grandchildren and, and acquaintances. We need a system. We basically need all hands on deck to make sure that caregiving is sustainable. So sometimes I think this part of this expectation piece we have around the formal system is that it's going to protect, that the formal system will come in and be able to offer us these services to which we are, entitled. Anybody can get them. There's no kind of stigma around them, and that we're not going to have to ask anybody for help, because most of us really don't like that. The reality and maybe even the best practice would be a little from column A and a little from column B. We're going to have some formal services, and that's great, and we're also going to need to really be honest with our family and friends about the things that we need.
Yeah, I agree. And it is a really hard thing to ask for help and sometimes even accept it. But I think it goes back to our first question about, what's the right balance. And if you don't do some asking and accepting, you probably won't keep your balance. So it's a really key piece.
I'm noticing that Maria has asked a question about wait times for cognitive assessment.
Right.
And I think, again, we're talking about different health authorities, and I'm not sure if I can really answer that question. Like, I would have no idea what would be the case for, say, the Lower Mainland. So I think, Janet, you can help me here maybe.
Yeah, it really varies.
Yeah,
I think it would be dangerous too, because if you're getting a formal cognitive assessment, you're probably waiting for a specialist, and in that case, you could be waiting a month or 2 months, I would imagine, in most cases. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure. It really depends on the type of cognitive assessment as well, because family doctors can do one level of cognitive assessment, but if it's to formalize a diagnosis of some sort, then typically you're looking at a specialist. So Maria, I'm sorry about that. It's just really difficult to generalize, but usually, your physician can give you some idea of wait times.
I think the most important point there might be expect that there's going to be a wait time. That it's definitely going to be something that's not quick.
Right.
I think that's probably true across all health authorities. Yeah, so I see that Nettie has said that most friends and neighbors always have excuses or other things that they're busy with. Yeah, I know. It's hard. Part of this new work that I'm doing around helping, essentially it's like getting a professional, like, somebody who works in a caregiver support program, or to have to basically have a meeting with family, friends, neighbors, to sort of take the asking out of the hands of the caregiving family. And so that person would sort of meet with the caregiving family, find out who are the people that are in their lives or have been in their lives in the last little while, who are people that, they think might be able to offer something, even if it's, every 2 weeks or something like that. And so it's actually the facilitator who would call these people up and ask them to come to a meeting. And at the meeting, the facilitator has also created, with the caregiving family, a list of things that they need. And this can be very simple, like, in the weather that we're having, certainly on the island, it could be like, when it snows, can you come and shovel our walk? It could be something that simple. It could be something like, I would love to have, a casserole or a bowl of, a big pot of soup, every Sunday night. Or it could be, I need someone to drive us to the doctor's appointments that might be, further away. So it's a task list, and then the facilitator, basically does the asking for the other person, for the caregiving family. And we find that this actually works pretty well. I think sometimes people don't really understand how serious it is for caregivers and how much just knowing, just being able to count on, a weekly visit so you can get out and do something on your own for the afternoon would really make a huge difference in the caregiver's quality of life. So sometimes it takes, maybe a facilitator or somebody who does work with caregivers to give that message to neighbors and other family members and acquaintances, and so that, then they start to understand, like, we've really got to help Mary and Fred. Like, they're really struggling, and because I think the other thing that's happening, Nettie, and you're speaking to it exactly, is that there's so much activity, it seems. I feel this in my own life, too, where we're so busy that sometimes we don't even see each other, or, we don't even really understand how much we're neglecting the people that we care about. So sometimes just having this opportunity, like a support circle does, to just, say it very clearly. And then, of course, people can always decline and say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not able to sign up for any of these things. But, excuse me, to make this process rather formal, like, you have to sign up and you're committing. We call it a list of commitments. This is a model that we've used in the Cowichan Valley with some success, and so we're starting to teach it in other communities with the hope that, for some caregiving families, this might help a lot, just with the daily stuff of life.
Yeah, and I think at Family Caregivers, we're working with another agency that is doing a trial of Jodie's methodology, the methodology they're using in Cowichan. So maybe at some point we could do a webinar on that, Jodie, and it might be of interest to folks.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing, like, even if you don't, you don't need to know anything about this particular model, but just realizing, for ourselves as caregivers that, like, it's okay to also access some of the resources in your informal networks.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need special permission to do that. The special permission is already granted to you because you are a caregiver. It's okay for you to I think we're so worried about being a burden, but it's
Right.
okay for you to ask. And, I think the other piece that is worth mentioning is that in the model that I teach, it's the idea that offering something to other people is life-enhancing for the person who is giving. That the person who gives is also receiving, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that, I often tell this story about how, a woman I don't know very well, her father passed away quite suddenly. And so I got an email with a group of people who also knew this woman saying, we're going to organize meals for her. Here's the sign-up sheet. Well, I don't know the woman well enough on my own to have made her a meal, but because there was a sign-up sheet that went around on email, I said, okay, I'll make her a meal on this day. And all the other people signed up. And the day that I made her a meal and I drove it over to her house, and I was supposed to just leave it in a cooler outside of her door, but she answered the door and her eyes were all red from crying, and, I handed her the meal, and as I drove away, I just cried my eyes out. I just sobbed. And I think it was because I actually felt so elevated from having helped someone in a very small way. And now, I mean, I'm a social worker. That's what I do all day long in my job. But this was just in my life, And doing something for someone just made me feel so tender and in my heart. So I remember that experience, and I think it's good to ask people to help people who need help. It's when you can offer it, and just pause and take a moment or make time or commit to that. It actually is quite life enhancing and brings quite a lot to your life to care for others.
Right. So I see Nettie's put a comment in here that she had her first day with paid respite, and I'm getting the sense that, Nettie, you felt a bit disappointed about the checklist. So without directly answering that, I go to questions, and I'm wondering, well, was this person maybe taking time to get to know your care recipient and just getting a lay of the land? Sometimes our expectations are high, but then to your point, maybe you left a checklist of things that you would like to have done, and Yeah, it's really specific to the situation. I guess if you're being clear, though, that's one of the first things.
I think this gets into another topic, which is, basically the one about, I don't want to say difficult, but maybe more challenging conversations, right? So that's going to now take a follow-up conversation with this caregiver to be able to say, I noticed that I left a list the other day, but none of the things on my list got done. So I'm curious about what's supposed to happen in this relationship. What are your expectations of what you're going to do when you come to give respite? To have a clearer conversation. Is it really that the person is not going to ever do the things on that list, or what was actually happening there?
Yeah, like a conversation where that person can respond and explain maybe there's a reason why they weren't able to do what you had asked. I see Nettie is typing away, and it kind of borders on the next question we have as well. So it's about that communication, challenging communications, and
yeah, like from we did that webinar on nonviolent communication, and in that way of talking, we would express it in terms of a need. So we would say, I have a need for clarity, or I have a need for clear expectations for respite. So just so that I'm clear, what do you see as your role when you come into my home? What do you see as how you're going to spend your time? So the component says, oh yes, we've got the slide up, in that style of communication. So we say our observation, we can say a feeling, we express it in terms of a need, and then we make a request. So there's a little bit of a formula which goes like this, So in Nettie's case, Nettie, I hope you're okay if I just kind of make it up as I go here, but if I say...
Well, she's put some more information in the chat box. So she assumes she would clean up from lunch and do the...
blood pressure and take the things out of the dryer. So a great way to start would be to say, I noticed that the other day when you were here that the lunch wasn't cleaned up and you didn't do the blood pressure and the things were still in the dryer. I feel confused and I have a need for clarity in my expectation. That's a little wordy, but you could say, I'm feeling confused and I have a need to clear this up. Would you be willing in the future to do the things on the checklist?
Right.
And then that gives the other person an opportunity to say, yeah, no, I'm not going to do your checklist. Or it gives the person an opportunity to say, sort of what Janet is suggesting. Actually, for the first day, I really just wanted to get to know your home and spend some time with the care recipient. Or she might say, or he or she might say, well, actually, in the time I have here, I only have time for 2 to 3 tasks. So if you can provide me with a checklist of 2 to 3 tasks, I will try to get those done. And then at least going forward, you know what you can expect. Because it sounds like what was difficult for you in that situation, Nettie, was that you came home and you were sort of disappointed that those things hadn't been done.
I see Helen is typing now too. It's an interesting topic. Yeah. Maybe we'll wait and see what Helen types in, and then I think we have another question that sort of touches on the communication piece as well.
It's funny because so often in our communication we think we're being very clear. I mean, I agree with you, Nettie. Making a checklist is very clear and very organized. So, how does that go wrong? But, human life is very messy. And we always have to have these clarifying conversations, and I don't think there's any of us who really enjoy that, but they do help.
Right. Yeah, so Helen just said that it must be tricky to, come into a new situation. And I think there are different comfort levels with different situations. But, to your point, Nettie, if you had left a list, then you would kind of expect that some of those things had been done. So just being clear, and being curious about why it didn't happen, I think would be helpful. They might not. Yeah,
That's a great point.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right.
Yeah, yeah. And I think too, that we often just have, we often hear from caregivers that their experience of respite is that no two workers are alike. So that, it is frustrating. I think it's one of the biggest frustrations we hear sometimes from caregivers is that it's a different worker every week. So it's very hard to get any kind of consistency, and that each worker, even though they're essentially doing the same job, are actually performing very different tasks and, in a different style, at a different pace, and so that's something that we hear from caregiving families, that they find that frustrating, I think there's so much of caregiving that we really are seeking some order, even those of us who, aren't maybe temperamentally that kind of person, but, wouldn't it be great if you could just leave the house for a few hours and come back to some order?
Right.
That would be great.
Yeah, no kidding.
But,
So I think we should move on to the next question, and this one, again, is pretty typical of a lot of the questions that we get to our support line. How should I help my siblings who don't live close by understand the decisions that need to be made re our mom's care? So, Jodie, I'll let you start on this one, and we'll see, if we have any further input from folks.
Yeah, so I think this is perhaps one of the more frustrating things, as I was saying before, a lot of our caregiving is invisible, and that the people around us can often be quite tone deaf to our experience, meaning they don't get it, You don't get it when you don't get it. And siblings who don't live close by and who aren't in the same kind of caregiving role that we are relative to our parents, they're going to have a lot of trouble getting it. And, I'm just assuming that there's also going to be some complicated feelings there, that often we feel maybe relieved that we don't have to do the caregiving, but at the same time we feel sort of guilty that it's all falling on our sibling who happens to live close by. Do you see what I mean? So there could be all kinds of other feelings going on there for siblings who live far away that might cloud their judgment. So it sounds like from the question that the caregiver who does live close by to the mom is making some decisions about their care. And the faraway siblings don't agree with that, or, are having some trouble with it. So I think this is one of those areas where it's okay for caregivers to advocate for themselves. It helps not to try, and I know this is sort of silly, but to try not to be triggered. I think, again, we can do so much to help ourselves by seeing and hearing ourselves, So even in this conversation to recognize, this person doesn't know what my caregiving life is, but I do. I can see and hear myself. And that takes the pressure off needing our siblings to understand us. To a certain degree, if they're not caregiving the way we are, they're not really going to understand. But at the same time, we can give them a chance to understand. We can say, let me describe what a typical day is. And again, we have to stay out of resentment. We have to stay out of blame or trying to make anybody feel guilty. It's just like, here's what happens in a given day, So here's a good way. If we're talking about nonviolent communication, we can say, so I notice that you seem to disagree with some of the decisions I'm making about Mom. And that makes me feel really angry and frustrated because I have a need for respect for my role as the caregiver who's here day in, day out. And are you willing to have more of a detailed conversation about what it's really like to be here and caregive for Mom? And so hopefully then the other person will say, yeah, I do want to know more about it, or sure, let's talk about it. So I think sometimes, the caregiver role, like we often say, it's like the frog in the pot, The water's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and we don't often notice how uncomfortable we are until the water is boiling. And so when we're communicating from that place, we can sometimes be a little hot-headed or resentful or grumpy or just angry and emotional. And, sometimes we actually, as the caregiver, have to be in a place where we do some education. We can educate our siblings on what it's like. If they've never been a caregiver, they probably don't really get it. They don't know what it's like. So we can say, so here's why I actually have Dad going to a day program 3 times a week, even though he says he doesn't want to go. But when he goes there, he really does enjoy it. And I need him to go. It doesn't harm him to go, even if he doesn't want to go and he says he doesn't want to go. It doesn't harm him to go, and I need him to go to be able to keep doing this. Now, we all agree that we want Dad to be able to stay home as long as possible. That's what everybody wants. And so in order for me to keep doing this, that I'm going to need some time during the day to myself. And that we don't need to apologize for that, right?
Right.
So sometimes we just need to be able to advocate for ourselves a little bit, to tell the truth, without clouding things with, because you are not here and because I have to do it all by myself. Right? The minute we bring guilt into a conversation, we're trying to sort of, the founder of Nonviolent Communication would say that's actually violent communication. Because we're not going to get the kind of response that's going to lead to connection. When we try to make someone else feel guilty, they're going to respond by disconnecting from us, which is the opposite of what we want.
So when we did the Nonviolent Communication webinar, Jodie, one of the things you said really resonated with me, and that was the first step. Somehow that one sets the stage for everything else, and you said, say what you see. And so, in the situation we're talking about, the caregiver could absolutely state the facts and what they see about both the mother and how the mother is coping, but also like test results or what the doctors have been saying, or, things that haven't been going as well as the other person might think, and make them as factual as possible so they're not open to interpretation. It's not just the way you're looking at the world. It's actually something that can't be disputed.
That's right. So a lot of the time, instead of making that observation or stating the facts, what we'll actually do is make an evaluation or an assessment. So we'll say, well, it's really, really bad, and this is what the test said, instead of just saying the test said this and this is what the doctor said. You know what I mean? Because otherwise we're really bringing an emotional tone to things that makes it harder for other people to respond from their hearts. Yeah, so say what you see. It's a good shorthand.
So using this one, I just, this helps explain it, and this is just the slide from that presentation. I encourage everybody to go and listen to that Coach Caregiver webinar. It was a really great one on nonviolent communication, and it is now up on our website, so if you just click on it, you'll be able to listen to the recorded webinar. But this, I totally made this up, but it might be something like, say what you see, so that the mother's having difficulty managing day-to-day activities like shopping, banking, house maintenance, and that you're feeling overwhelmed, so you're going to the feeling, and then your need would be to know that she's safe and getting what she needs, and the ask is that you would like to work with your relative to develop a plan. And that might be a much more successful way if you're already anticipating it's going to be difficult to get people on board with decisions that need to be made. This might be another way of approaching that.
Yes, and I think it's really important, and for those of you who maybe were at that other webinar, it's a bit of repetition, but normally what we say, we might get as far as saying, I feel overwhelmed, but then 9 times out of 10, we'll say, because you. Right. I feel overwhelmed because you're so far away and I can't get any help. I feel overwhelmed because And so we often, the next thing that comes out of our mouth after because is because you. And of course the other person hears that as an accusation because essentially that's what it is. When we can claim it as something that we need, so that the big shift in nonviolent communication is to say, I feel overwhelmed because I have a need to know that she's safe in getting what she needs. And that kind of language helps the other person, even if it's a person we are having a conflict with, move closer to us rather than further away. And we don't see a lot of the time in our communication that some of the things we say can only cause the other person to step back from us. They have no choice. We're accusing them of things. It feels terrible. But when we can claim it just as our own experience, I feel overwhelmed because I have a need to know that she's safe. That's a much more neutral statement, and the person can, take it, oh, how can I help you with that? You can feel the softening just in that phrasing.
To sign off, I think. So I just want to say thank you, all of you, for joining us on this 1 week, just over 1 week away from Christmas.